Welcome, everyone, both those who are here in the McNair Center for Free Enterprise at Northwood University and those who are watching online. Tonight we have a panel on immigration. Trevor Kraus, he's a story editor and scriptwriter for Learn Liberty, and also a relatively new thing called Invisible Lens. It's a YouTube channel, just like Learn Liberty. Both are powered by Students for Liberty. And I am Alex Tokarev, an economics professor at Northwood, America's Free Enterprise University. Some people said that this is going to be a debate. I don't know to what extent it will be a debate. Both of us are libertarian, and we'll see where we disagree. There was a meme that I enjoyed very much on social media. Two cartoonish libertarians meet, and one suggests, "Oh, let's have a libertarian debate," and the other says, "Okay, let's do it." And they start. The first one says, "You're a socialist." The other says, "No, you're a socialist." I guess all of this began. Please come in. Plenty of seats. I guess this all started with a trip that libertarians from the United States took to Europe soon after the end of the Second World War. And supposedly they had an argument. I don't know what the topic was, but the leading libertarian of those days, Ludwig von Mises, at some point could not take it, that his fellow libertarians were not purist, that they were not radical in their beliefs, in their views. And so he stormed out of the room yelling, "You're all a bunch of socialists." Okay. I see many of my students here tonight from my, hey Dale. I see many of my philosophy of the American life and business students, and some of my economics of public choice, of public policy students. And there are two things that I explain at the very beginning, and you'll recognize it immediately. I'll need your help to finish those. There are two things which I expect all my students to learn. One, there is no such thing as a free lunch. That's right. Two, people respond to what? Come on. Incentives. Yes, people respond to incentives. All other lessons we teach in political economy are applications of thing one and thing two. Today, I want us to examine how the second one applies to the worst crisis we face today. Since Biden made Kamala our border czar, we suffered the biggest influx of illegals in the history of America. It is tempting to explain it away with civil wars and political persecutions in third world countries. However, such humanitarian crises are nothing new. And the world today is much safer than in the past. With a few exceptions, such as socialist countries like North Korea and Venezuela, life is much more comfortable all over the planet. Yet, millions keep coming every year to the United States. So, we must find out what happened that dramatically changed the cost-benefit calculus. Due to modern technologies, the whole world sees that the West offers better economic opportunities. Because of the insane immigration policies of Biden-Harris and some European Union governments, the risk of being punished for breaking laws is zero. Instead of jails, courts, fines, and deportations, we offer those who invade our borders rewards: free food, housing, healthcare, and education. We give them unprecedented incentives to come. Is it any wonder that they move by the millions? If you want to change that, you must change the incentives. When the costs of crossing illegally exceed the expected benefits, the flood will turn into a trickle. I teach at Northwood, America's free enterprise university. I'm a free market guy who learned economics from Mrs. Hayek and Friedman. Most free trade proponents think that, to be consistent, they must support free immigration or open borders. When I helped to translate a book by Hans Hermann Hoppe in Bulgarian, I learned that free trade and restricted immigration are mutually reinforcing positions. Even the most restrictive immigration policy has nothing to do with the rejection of free trade. You may not want to associate with or live nearby someone like me. You may not like to be in a neighborhood of Orthodox Christians or economics professors. It doesn't mean that you don't want to trade with them from a distance. The relationship between trade and immigration is one of substitutability. Here's what I mean, what Hans Hermann Hoppe means. If Mexican products can freely enter the United States, incentives for Mexican workers and their families to invade our southern border is reduced. If America and Europe engage in protectionism against products of low-wage areas and in welfare policies at home, immigration pressures will be high. There are 3 questions that I use when I start my philosophy of free enterprise courses. I'll ask them, and all my students will recognize those and will be able to answer. What makes the transfer of property not theft? What makes work not slavery? And what makes sex not rape? And the answer to all 3 questions is yes, it is consent. How does this self-evident truth relate to the issues of trade and immigration? Trade and immigration are different in one fundamental way. Goods and services, they can move only by mutual consent. They cannot come from one to the other unless both sender and receiver agree. However, I can migrate without anyone else wanting me to do so. Free trade means trade by invitation. Thus, restricted trade does not mean protection from uninvited goods or services. Protectionism is a violation of the right of private households and firms to extend or to deny invitations to their own property. Restricted immigration, on the other hand, protects us from forced integration with unwanted invaders. If I advocate free trade and restricted immigration, I follow the same principle. Both require invitation for people and for goods. Voluntary, mutual consent. The free trade proponent who supports free immigration commits the sin of being inconsistent. Free trade and markets mean that we exchange goods and services without government interference. The government's only role is to maintain the trading process by protecting citizens and their property. However, with respect to the movement of people, the government must not permit events to take their own course. People, unlike products, possess a will. They can migrate on their own. Population movements, unlike product shipments, are not per se mutually beneficial. They're not always the result of an agreement between receiver and sender. There can be shipments, immigrants, without willing domestic recipients. In this case, Hoppe says immigration is an invasion. A government's basic functions include, of course, expulsion of foreign invaders. Immigrants must be subject to the same requirements as imports. A government cannot admit uninvited immigrants. All high-wage area governments presently, as you know, restrict immigration in some way. However, these restrictions are very different. So the question here is, which restrictions should a free marketeer like me support? To answer this question, Hoppe asks us to imagine an anarcho-capitalist society. And I know most of you, like most people, have no idea what that is. So in a nutshell, an anarcho-capitalist society is a place without government, where everything is privately owned. If we can defend our rights as property owners under this kind of arrangement, every movement of goods and of people can only happen by mutual consent. Now, you don't need to believe in the feasibility of establishing the anarcho-capitalist model. I'm not here to convince you. We have that kind of exercise week 14 with my students in philosophy. So you don't need to believe whether it's possible to have that kind of a system. That's not the purpose. Even anarcho-capitalists, a couple of years ago, we had David Friedman, a famous anarcho-capitalist who was here, and we talked over lunch, and I asked him, do you think that what you are advocating for can ever happen? And he said, not in my lifetime, not in my children's lifetime, probably not in my grandchildren's lifetime. So even anarcho-capitalists don't think that they're going to see this kind of social order. So why is then Hoppe using it? He introduces this concept only as a thought experiment, only to help us see what a government's immigration policy would have to be if it is purely libertarian, if it derived its legitimacy from the sovereignty of the people. A popular government's primary task is the protection of its citizens and their property. We just talked today with my freshman classes about Friedman's view of government as instrumentality. It has a purpose. Okay, what is that purpose? Well, to protect people and their property from acts of aggression. That popular government must preserve this no forced integration feature of anarcho-capitalism. Because we have a government, we also have this institution of public property. What does that mean? We talk about collective ownership by all domestic residents, controlled and administered by the state. The larger the amount of public government ownership, the greater the problem of forced integration. Consider a socialist country like Bulgaria, where I grew up under socialism before 1989. Bulgaria was sold, basically, to Stalin by the American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during World War II. Socialism means, for those of you who don't have a good working definition, socialism means that all factors of production, including land and natural resources, are publicly owned and controlled by the state in the hands of the government, of the party, the Communist Party elite. If the government admits an uninvited immigrant, it admits him to any place within the country. Without private land ownership, there are no limitations to his internal migrations, of course, other than those that are decreed by the government. After 1944, September the 9th, is when the Red Army crossed the Danube River and occupied Bulgaria. The Bulgarian government, the politicians that were chosen, handpicked by Stalin's people, they could quarter a stranger in someone else's private apartment. So they come to your home, knock on your door with their guns, and they say, well, from now on, this person is going to live in your house. You have to clean up this room and allow him to stay with you. Now, socialist countries, of course, are not high-wage areas. The problem of such countries is not immigration, but emigration. Socialist countries must sooner or later prohibit emigration and kill people for trying to leave, or they will be left without anybody to plunder. Capitalist countries, such as the United States, are favorite immigration destinations. A government-admitted immigrants movement is restricted by the extent of private property. Yet, by proceeding on public roads with public transportation and by staying on public land and in public buildings, an immigrant can come in contact with every American, whether he is wanted or not. He can move into most neighborhoods. Well, probably not near Obama's mansion in Martha's Vineyard. As long as any public property exists, forced integration cannot be avoided. The solution presents itself. The government must reduce the quantity of public property as much as possible. It should enforce my right to admit and exclude others from my property. The more completely this measure is carried out, the smaller will be the need for protective measures such as border defense. Why is the cost of protection against invaders along the US-Mexico border so high? Because for long stretches, from San Diego to South Padre Island, no private property exists on the American side. We should make it much harder for uninvited persons to enter and stay. The government must check all arriving persons for a valid invitation by a citizen. The inviting party can only dispose of his own private property. The immigrant must be excluded from all welfare. I think this is where we'll agree. The receiver, the one who invites someone to come to his property, should assume full legal responsibility for the actions of his invitee. Citizenship should be awarded only based on consent, contribution, and compatibility. Today, all Western governments are pursuing immigration policies that Hans-Hermann Hoppe considers to be too permissive. The extent of private property is substantial. Welfare provisions are high and growing. Foreigners are not excluded. And we don't even practice free trade, which we preach. To recap, free trade is inconsistent with free immigration, consistent with the non-aggression principle. All migration must be invited and contractual. The solution to our immigration crisis is privatization of public property, domestic laissez-faire, international free trade, and highly restrictive immigration policies. And Trevor goes next.
Thank you. And Dan, Alex asked if you could turn up the volume on our live stream. Appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Tokarev, and good evening, Northwood University, and hello to those of you streaming on YouTube. I'm Trevor Kraus, host and story editor for Learn Liberty and The Invisible Lens, which are both powered by Students for Liberty. I'm going to tell you why I'm convinced, after a lot of reading and thinking, that there is no justification for government-imposed immigration restrictions. And I'm going to tell a story, but first I want to clarify what I mean when I say there is no justification for government-imposed immigration restrictions. I do not mean the current situation where, as Dr. Tokarev and I indeed do agree, there are massive welfare state incentives for people to come to the US. We can and should talk later about how to dismantle this taxpayer-funded so-called free system of health insurance and education. But again, I think we'll agree there. I also do not mean that private property owning citizens should be unable to decide who enters their property and who doesn't. In fact, as I'll say again later, private citizens determining what to do with their own property is a great way to relieve the government of one of its so-called duties, and in doing so, reduce the size and the power of the state. What I do mean here is that the government has no morally legitimate role in determining who may cross an imaginary line in the sand and who may not. And this is true for the same reasons that the government has no morally legitimate role in telling me who may enter my house and who may not. Okay, so I promised a story, and here it is. It's adapted from an essay by Michael Humer of the University of Colorado. Marvin is starving. He's literally on the verge of death by malnourishment. Luckily, he has a plan. He's going to walk to the market and buy bread. But another person, Sam, sees Marvin coming to the market and forcibly prevents him from getting there. Marvin has no other option but to turn around and go home, and he dies of starvation. I think we'd all agree that Sam's justification for his behavior better be pretty darn good. So what could he say? He could say, well, Marvin's presence in the market will lead to higher prices for the rest of us. He could say, Marvin looks dangerous, and my daughter shops in the market, and I'm going to protect her. He could say, well, Marvin, you see, he speaks a foreign language, and he practices a different religion, and he's going to end up changing the market's culture. I ask you, is any of those sufficient to justify Sam's behavior? No. I hope it's obvious here that starving Marvin is a would-be immigrant and that Sam is the U.S. government. So again, I ask you to consider, is there any argument that Sam could make that is sufficient to justify his behavior? Now, it's not as easy to say no as I first thought. I was invited here in the first place because I wrote in one of my Independent Insights newsletters that immigration has or is close to having a consensus among libertarians. So thank you, Dr. Tokarev, for setting me straight on that and for inviting me. As he said, there are elegant cases for government restrictions on immigrations on these grounds: promoting free trade and defending property rights. They are elegant arguments, but they're wrong because they too fail to justify Sam's behavior. As Dr. Tokarev said, Hans Hermann Hoppe makes these cases, and I actually do agree with him on a lot. For example, he writes, in private property anarchy or anarcho-capitalism, all land is privately owned. All that exists in this kind of society is the freedom of independent private property owners to admit or exclude others from their own property. And note that this kind of private property anarchy eliminates the entire notion of immigration, and that's one reason among many I believe we should strive toward that society. And I want to reiterate, the unprecedented incentives that Dr. Tokarev rightly points out the American government gives to immigrants to move here, they're unjustifiable and unsustainable. But they are unjustifiable and unsustainable because the welfare state itself is those things for populations of any size and any demographic makeup. Hoppe also writes, free trade and restricted immigration are perfectly consistent and mutually reinforcing. Dr. Tokarev gave that quote. And Dr. Tokarev, echoing Hoppe in another presentation he gave, put a finer point on it. The relationship between trade and migration is one of substitutability. If Mexican products, he argues, can freely enter the United States, then incentive for Mexican workers and their families to enter will be reduced. So the conclusion they reach is obvious. More immigration equals less trade. Less trade is bad. Therefore, we should reduce immigration. And yes, when it comes to free trade, eliminating tariffs and making trade truly free would raise living standards throughout the world. But the relationship between trade and migration is not one of substitutability. And I can tell you why through another story. After my parents divorced, my dad moved into an apartment complex where a lot of Indian folks lived. And he had bad asthma, and he would sometimes complain about the strong smell of curry in the hallways. But I loved the smell, and today Indian food is my favorite cuisine. Do you think that would be the case if I hadn't been exposed to those wonderful smells at a young age? Maybe, but I doubt it. And sure, I might have been able to buy or trade for the individual spices, right? The cumin, the coriander, the ginger. But my exposure to those spices in the hands of talented native chefs is why I partly love Indian food now. Ask yourself, if you had never seen or smelled a burrito, would you have more reason or less reason to buy refried beans and flour tortillas at the grocery store? This connection between free trade and immigration is important to Hoppe because he correctly argues that if I buy a box of, say, poblano peppers from Mexico, I'm inviting some person in Mexico to send me that box. And in exchange, I send him money, which he has invited me to send. Our transaction is one of mutual consent, again, as Dr. Tokarev said, in which neither person's property rights are violated. But not all shipments like this are really the result of voluntary transactions. Look no further than the unsolicited junk mail I get every few months from my alma mater. Is my beloved University of Missouri violating my property rights by sending me these cards? Based on my reading, Hoppe would say yes. In his book, Democracy, the God That Failed, he writes, the current situation in the United States and Western Europe is forced integration, plain and simple. And of course, a forced integration would be a violation of property rights. So the question becomes, is force an appropriate term? To me, it illuminates a contradiction. Dr. Tokarev has argued that it's possible to not want to associate or live with or live in a neighborhood of, say, Indian people. But that doesn't mean that you won't buy spices from them. So he's saying you can choose to ignore, avoid, and exclude Indian people from your life, but you can still eat their food. You can still trade with them. That seems unlikely to actually happen. But if it does, it implies that the integration is not forced. So again, is force an appropriate term here? This is the crux of the issue because Dr. Tokarev, quoting Hoppe, says restricted immigration protects us from forced integration with unwanted invaders. And I encourage you to ask me in our Q&A a little bit later why I dislike the terminology invaders. But for now, I'll recognize that sometimes integration really is forced. Take the Little Rock Nine, where President Dwight Eisenhower ordered the Army's 101st Airborne Division to literally escort African-American students into Central High School. I can give a more recent analogy that clarifies this difference between forcing and permitting COVID vaccines. The government tried to force the integration of the liquid into our bloodstreams with various threats. And that was immoral, and the government should not have done it. And it was also, of course, wrong to use tax money to bribe people to take the vaccine. But the government obviously should not have prohibited the development of the vaccine either. It should simply have allowed each of us to choose whether we wanted to take it or not. When it comes to immigration, Hoppe conflates these two acts. This term, forced integration, has great rhetorical power, And I think he therefore felt inclined to use it. And Dr. Tokarev experienced the horrors, as he pointed out, of real forced integration in his native Bulgaria, where the government made private citizens take soldiers into their private homes. That is forced integration. But it simply doesn't apply to the issue of allowing people to cross imaginary lines in the sand. The force involved, if any, comes from the government's immoral extraction of money from citizens, which we probably agree is wrong, to fund welfare state immigration. At the end of the day, as David Friedman writes in The Machinery of Freedom, it's a shame the argument must be put in these economic or psychological terms. It's simpler than that. There are people, probably many millions, who would like to come here, live here, work here, raise their children here, and die here. Open the gates. As I've learned from Friedman, and as Hoppe himself admits, in a free society, in the society we libertarians strive for, this problem of immigration would not exist. But if we're ever going to achieve that society, we must not fall into the trap that Hoppe did. And this is ultimately my biggest contention with him. This trap that there are some problems that only the government can solve. There are not. And he knows it. I quote, "The authority to admit or exclude should be reassigned to the states, cities, towns, villages, and ultimately to private property owners and their voluntary associations." Hoppe could have saved us all a lot of time by stopping right there. But since we're here anyway, I'll say again, the surest path toward the society we want, the safest path toward reducing the size and power of the state, is to find the areas where the government is clearly overburdened and might welcome a lightening of its load. Immigration is one such area. And I don't know exactly what the solution is, but I do know that immigration is a chance to remind people that entrepreneurs sensing opportunities to remove felt uneasiness, as Mises would say, for other people, and the free market sorting system of competition are what best solve problems, even problems like immigration that the government created in the first place. Thank you.
Okay, here's what we are going to do. We have Professor Gabriel from our economics department who will moderate a short conversation of the two panelists. We'll use that microphone for that.
For those of you watching on YouTube, we're going to have a discussion moderated by Gabriel, and Dr. Tokarev and I will
we'll move there.
sit up here.
Catch that. When this is over, the live stream will end, and we'll sit here and you'll take the quiz, and we'll stay for more discussion with the students who will take the seminar for credit after my extra credit students have been dismissed. Okay. Well, let's take our seats. Trevor, would you like some water?
Oh, I'm okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation and the talk. I would like to start this discussion with the definition of invited immigrant and an invader immigrant, because I felt there's some disagreement there, so I would like to explore that a little bit.
First of all, I hope you already noticed I've been referring to Hoppe and what I've been doing all night, and I'll continue to do it until I'm done, is, I'll be like a surrogate for Hans Hermann Hoppe. Okay, I'm presenting, if you have ever heard a libertarian speak on this issue, you've probably thought that the only position libertarians can take is open borders. That's what I thought myself. One of my first picnics when I was a graduate student at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, we went to this lake, and they had a picnic, the local libertarians. And they explained to me why they don't want any borders, those imaginary lines in the sand that we have to just ignore. And as a Bulgarian who was in his first year as a graduate student and who was already making plans to stay, that sounded very appealing. So tonight what I'm doing is giving you the minority report within the libertarian movement. And what does Hoppe mean when he says uninvited immigrants being invaders? Well, if we have a government, if we are not living in this anarcho-capitalist world, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we want the government to do? And obviously, the government should protect every citizen's private property against acts of aggression. What about the rest of the country? If we think of the rest of America, all the public lands, as something that belongs to all Americans, well, by extension, I think it's logical to conclude that the government's role should be exactly the same. It should stop uninvited people from coming to my house, and it should stop uninvited people from coming to the public lands of the United States of America. So this is what Hoppe draws as a conclusion here.
Thank you. So I mentioned during my presentation about this terminology of invaders or uninvited invaders. And the first thing I wanted to say is that we're not going to win anybody over to our cause by using that terminology. So I think it's bad politically, but I also think it's wrong morally to paint illegal immigrants with terms like illegal. Samuel Edward Konkin is one of my favorite writers. He would call them agents of counter-economics, and he defines counter-economics as all non-coercive human action committed in defiance of the state. And we laud and appreciate a lot of people who commit non-coercive acts in defiance of the state. Tax evaders, speeders on the highway, users of illegal drugs, prostitutes. Those are all people who are committing illegal acts, but we don't think of them, we don't look down upon them morally for those things, because we recognize that their action is non-coercive. And I think immigrants are acting non-coercively. To the extent that they invade or take over or use public property, Dr. Tokarev and I agree that I think public property in the first place is the problem. So shouldn't we go about reducing the quantity of public property before we do anything? And I also want to ask you, you said basically that Hoppe would argue that because the government exists, it should do certain things. But I would push back and say the libertarian position would be to only go kicking and screaming for each one of the additional things that the government wants to do. So if you say, okay, the government is established, I'm going to fight you kicking and screaming on that in the first place. If you say the government has a purpose, I'm going to fight you kicking and screaming on that. And then a lot of people would say that the most important thing a government can do is provide courts to resolve disputes peacefully. And I'm going to fight you kicking and screaming on that. And so every additional role that Hoppe or Dr. Tokarev might assign to the government, I think the libertarian position is to only go kicking and screaming with each additional responsibility or duty the government claims.
So just a follow-up on this question. So who defines who is invited and who is an invader? Like if there is one person who wants someone to come and work for me, but nobody else in the whole country wants it, is it granted that that person is not welcome?
Yeah, that's another thing that I've been observing in a forum, online forum for the Bulgarian Libertarian Society. When they disagree, okay, they always try to point out, and the beginning of the argument is, this is not libertarian. Okay, so what is libertarian here? If there is even a single person who wants some foreigner to come to his private property to work for them, and the government stops this person from crossing the border and arriving in the company of this citizen of the United States. Then this, Hoppe says, is forced exclusion. Okay, this is not right. Just as if a person wants to cross the border without anybody, any individual, so it's the individual. Okay, the government is just the tool to make sure that anyone who comes has a willing recipient. That's it. That's the whole argument that he's making. If there is one person who wants the foreigner to come and the government stops this voluntary movement, then the government is wrong. And if no one wants that person to come and the government brings him in, well, that is, according to the definition that Hoppe gives us, forced integration, and that is just as wrong as the forced exclusion.
And I would ask you, how many situations are there really in which not a single person among 350 million Americans would want someone to come across the border? I mean, I'm pretty comfortable assuming that some landlord or shop owner or employer somewhere in this great big land of ours would indeed want more people to possibly be his employees. The shop owner might want more people to possibly shop in his store. The landlord might want more people to possibly rent his apartments. So if even one person would agree to have an immigrant cross the border, then what the government's doing is wrong. And I think there is not a single situation you could come up with in which sorry, let me take that back. There are very rare cases in which not a single person would admit to an immigrant crossing the border.
Okay, so one argument that I often hear is of the imaginary line of why it is important. So one argument is that we need some sort of separation from good and bad ideas. Like, how do we know which institution is good, is doing a good job, and which institution is doing a bad job in terms of governance, for example? So the border, the imaginary line, sets that limitation of what is a good idea and a bad idea. So how would each of you respond to that?
I think the absolute worst possible organization to be determining what is a good idea and a bad idea is the government. So a government border is almost by definition going to be a bad way to adjudicate what's a good idea and what's not.
Well, borders are a method for residents in a certain area to monitor who's coming in and going out. So we have to pick specific examples in order to figure out whether that kind of border restriction is a good one or a bad one. For example, they built about 60 years ago the Berlin Wall. They had this border with all the security added in the early 60s because the people in socialist Germany, in the East German Republic and in East Berlin, were trying to cross into the western side. So the wall they built was to keep people in. So this was a wall that kept people prisoners. In the case of the United States, it is to stop, again, what Hoppe would call uninvited migration of individuals. He uses the word invasion because this is historically what invasion means. Okay, there is a group of people that are not citizens, that are not members of this society that's has settled here, and they are coming without an invitation, without the consent of the property owners on this side of this border, of this imaginary line. As for good ideas, I think classical liberal ideas based on which America has been built have proven in 250 years to be a pretty good one. And I think it's worth defending those ideas and making sure that if people are coming, that they really share those values. Because if we live in a society under government and everybody has the right to vote, and we bring 400 million people who want Sharia law, well, they can easily change the constitution. They can impose Sharia law by a legal process, by democratic voting. And the rest of us will lose what we so dearly love and have been protecting for 2.5 centuries. It's happening in Europe, by the way. As we speak, they have been indiscriminately letting people come. And, well, the character of these countries, I have here, even now, students from some Western European countries, those countries are losing their identity. Okay? Whether it's France, whether it's Germany, they, unlike the United States, they are not assimilating those migrants into their culture. Okay? They set up their separate communities. They don't want to mix with the local people. Basically, they come to escape bad ideas, and they bring those bad ideas with them. And they demand that their new country adopts some of those bad laws, bad rules, bad institutions that caused the misery that they escaped from. That wasn't a libertarian argument, by the way, just a cultural observation as someone who grew up in Europe and has been going there every summer.
And I'll be brief on this. I think the ideas of the West, classical liberal ideas, are not so weak as to need the defense of a bad and inefficient and weak institution like the government. If we believe that these ideas lead to prosperity and justice and all those good things, then they will stand up to however many million people come from wherever they come from.
Okay, so my final question for discussion, we're going to talk about incentives, which are very important in economics. So what do you think is the driving incentive for immigration? Because we talked about a lot welfare state, but my perspective, maybe it's not necessarily the welfare state, but just labor markets. There is a demand for labor, and people are responding to that demand and are trying to come to the country. So I wonder what your thoughts are.
I'm inspired on this topic by Murray Rothbard, who was an anarcho-capitalist economist. And he pointed out that high-wage areas are in part high-wage because of their immigration restrictions. And I said that this would be like if Kalamazoo, where I have family, implemented a price floor for housing, right? Housing can't drop below this limit, the price of an apartment or a house, and then started calling itself an affluent city. Well, that would be true to an extent, but it would be missing a big part of the point. And I think such a big reason why we think the United States or of Western Europe as a high wage area is because of this illegitimate restriction on the supply of labor.
I think we here, specifically in the United States, have been blessed by attracting me. I am an immigrant, and Gabriel is an immigrant. So both of us have come here for the economic opportunities. And I think most people do come for the opportunities to start a new life in a new place that is unburdened by many restrictions that they have lived under in their own countries. And so people come here not so much for those welfare benefits, which unfortunately we have been bestowing upon people indiscriminately when they come in violation of our laws. So what about Europe? It depends on how generous those benefits are. There are people who go to Western European countries because of those generous benefits. But if you ask them, I haven't talked to many of them. If you ask them, probably they would tell you that they would prefer to have a job, to be able to start a business. If the government removes some of the restrictions imposed on those newly arrived immigrants, as Ken Schoolland, who was here last week, he sent me, and I shared with Trevor, 3 essays on immigration that he wrote. He points out something that both of us will agree. Most of the problems with immigration come from bad government interventions. They are not problems of the free market. Okay, and yes, I believe that our culture, that our ideas are good enough to withstand any kind of pressure. It's just that we should be carefully introducing, okay, how much of the new will mix with the old, so that we have really enough time to integrate, to assimilate those people, to become real Americans, as I have become a real American, as Gabriel will be a real American, maybe even already is, long before the American government bestows upon himself the right to vote.
And I would ask you to consider, I assume American citizens, as am I, consider what Ayn Rand said as it pertains to Gabrielle and Dr. Tokarev. She said, I chose to be an American. What did you do? And what does that suggest about the millions of other people who want to choose to become Americans and enact that and go to great lengths and take great personal risks in order to do so? I think the huge majority of people who go to those lengths really want to be Americans and want to espouse our values.
Okay, thank you.
This is where we will end the live stream. Thank you to all the online viewers. We'll continue with an informal, first of all, the quiz that I promised, and then we'll stay behind with the Freedom Seminar students to continue our discussion. Thank you, everybody.